They stood in a semicircle, some with tears, some with a cigarette, some openly relieved. The man's name was Viktor. He lived in Perm. His relatives decided that his heart had given out after a week-long drinking binge. They called an ambulance. The doctors pronounced him dead. The body was sent to the morgue. A day later, the funeral, everything was going according to the usual scenario. The coffin lid was closed, they began to lower it, and under the lid, Viktor regained consciousness. Just a few breaths of the stale, sour air were enough for him to realize was in a coffin. It wasn't just dark, it was pitch black. The pressure of the lid above his face muffled sounds from above. At first, a couple of seconds of shock, then panic. Viktor started screaming, pounding on the lid with his hands. The boards creaked, and the relatives, stunned, stopped the lowering process. Someone screamed, someone turned pale and fainted. The cemetery workers thought it was a spirit, but the knocking was all too real. They opened it. Viktor was alive, sweaty, wrapped in a pale sheet, with scratched fingers. Those around him recoiled. Someone even crossed themselves. Later, he would tell how he heard his own funeral, the voices of his relatives, how he wanted to scream, but his tongue wouldn't obey. The ambulance arrived for the second time, but now to resuscitate the man who had come back to life. The doctors didn't argue with the miracle, they simply took him to intensive care. And this case became one of the most famous in the Urals. However, the real shock didn't come when he woke up, but when it turned out that he had been declared dead without an autopsy and without an ECG. But even Viktor did not experience the same horror as a woman who woke up in a body bag in the morgue. Claudia Lopez from Argentina was considered dead for almost a whole day. Her body was taken to the morgue after her internal organs failed due to a rare allergic reaction. There, inside a metal drawer, she regained consciousness. Her hands were tied, the bag was zipped shut, it was dark and eerily cold inside. Shock, tears, frantic breathing. Claudia had no idea where she was. Only the smell of formaldehyde and metal made her realize she was among the dead. Her screams shattered the silence of the morgue. The morgue guard, hearing a muffled shriek, at first thought it was just a phantom noise. But the sound came again. A rasp, a thud, the clatter of the metal door of the cold chamber. He called for help. And together, they cautiously opened the drawer. The woman inside the bag was thrashing and trying to break free. When they pulled her out, she was in a state of deep hysteria. As it turned out later, Claudia had been mistakenly declared dead. They hadn't checked her pulse or performed an ECG. The doctor, in a hurry to finish his shift, simply signed off the paperwork. When the case became public through the media, everyone blamed it on a technical error. But the question remained, how many more such mistakes go unnoticed? How many people have actually been buried alive? And sometimes they even start to bury them. This incident happened in a small Brazilian village. The woman's name was Lourdes, and she was nearly 70. She supposedly died in her sleep. No autopsy or examination was performed. Everyone was gathered the next morning. The ceremony was over quickly. Locals are used to burying people without delay. The climate is hot, and the morgue is far away. The coffin was closed and carried out. Dirt began to fall onto the lid. After a few shovelfuls, Lourdes regained consciousness. Whether it was from lack of air, the noise, or the impact of the earth, no one knows. But she screamed. In a panic, she started pounding on the lid. The coffin shook, the workers recoiled in horror, and the relatives froze. One of the younger nephews kept his wits about him, ran over, and started digging her out. When they tore off the lid, the woman was lying on her side with bloody fingers and a pale face. Alive, in shock, but breathing. The whole village was talking about only one thing: how could such a mistake have happened? There was no answer. The doctor who had signed the certificate resigned the next day, and Lourdes never slept alone again. According to her relatives, she would wake up at the slightest noise, cry at night, and insist that the light be left on for her. But it's even more terrifying to end up underground when you're just a child. The story took place in the early 2000s on the outskirts of a Siberian village. The girl was only 8 years old. A cold, high fever, convulsions. They called a doctor, who diagnosed cardiac arrest. There wasn't much paperwork. The family was poor. The funeral was scheduled for the next morning. The coffin was simple, without any decorations. The girl was buried quickly, right at the village cemetery, without a priest. A few hours later, an old man, the caretaker of the local chapel, happened to pass by the cemetery. He heard a strange sound, as if someone was scratching at the boards, then dull thuds. He stopped and listened. His heart clenched. He ran to get a shovel. When they opened the grave, the girl was no longer breathing, but there were clear signs in the coffin. Her nails were torn off, her eyes were open, and there were traces of blood on her lips. She had woken up already underground and died from suffocation. After this incident, the village began to bury everyone no sooner than 2 days after death. The fear lingered for decades. And what is even more frightening is that this is far from an isolated story. And sometimes death doesn't come on its own, it is brought with an injection. An orderly at a city hospital in Indonesia injected a drug that was supposed to calm the body before sending it to the morgue. The problem was that the drug turned out not to be a sedative, but a powerful paralytic poison. The patient was still alive, just couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't let anyone know he was alive. He heard everything. His wife's sobs, the words of farewell, the doctor saying, "It's over," and how they put him in the bag. Even when they loaded him into the vehicle, he felt every jolt, but couldn't move a single finger. Only several hours later in the morgue did an assistant notice that his eyelids were twitching. They saved him just in time. Now think about it, how many patients whom people were comforting with their final goodbyes were actually still alive? How many such bodies have been sent to morgues? And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the mistakes doctors still make today. Every time a doctor says he's dead, there could be a mistake behind those words. In most cases, it's a fact, but sometimes it's just a poor examination. Mistakes in declaring death aren't fiction, they're a reality, especially in countries where access to medical equipment is limited or doctors are overworked. One of the main reasons is the so-called pseudo-death. This is a condition where the heartbeat and breathing are so weak that standard examination methods can't detect them. At the same time, the person remains conscious or partially conscious and can feel everything. Imagine you can't move, you can't say a word, but you hear everything, even the doctor telling your loved ones that you've passed away. Such cases are especially terrifying in hospitals, where each patient only gets a few minutes of attention. Doctors rushing to finish their shift, or conversely, frightened relatives in a village who declare death themselves without calling specialists. Medicine knows dozens of documented cases where a person was considered dead but then opened their eyes. Sometimes on the operating table, sometimes in the morgue, and worst of all, when already in the coffin. But even in the past, people were well aware of these mistakes, and the fear of being buried alive was not paranoia, but an everyday reality. You've probably heard the expression, "Let's wait 3 days to be sure." This isn't folklore, it's a real practice that was followed in Europe, Russia, and Latin America. People were afraid of burying someone too soon. And the reason is simply there were just too many cases where the dead woke up. In the old days, there was a term lethargia, deep sleep, in which a person appeared dead. Cold skin, no breathing, a weak pulse. But after a day or two, the person could wake up as if nothing had happened. That's why in aristocratic households, the deceased was kept for at least 3 days, sometimes even a week. The coffin was left open, candles were lit, prayers were said, but they waited. There were even professions for watching over the dead. These were people who kept an eye on the body, watching for any movement, changes in skin color, or a twitch of a finger. Only when all the signs of decomposition became obvious was the burial carried out. The paradox is that in the 21st century, with all the equipment, technology, scanners, and defibrillators, mistakes happen just as often. It's just that now they're better hidden. But in past centuries, people came up with something else terrifying yet ingenious. Hearing a bell ring from the cemetery sounds like a scene from a horror movie, but in the past, it was an everyday reality. In many 19th century cemeteries, you could spot a strange contraption. A rope running from inside the coffin up to the surface, with a bell attached outside. If the dead person woke up, they could pull the rope, the bell would ring, and someone would come, dig them up, and save them. These devices were called safety coffins. In some countries, they were installed by default. There were even entire catalogs where you could order a coffin with an alarm system. Sometimes, they even added tubes so you could breathe while waiting to be dug up. But there was also an unintended effect. The wind could move the rope, or animals could tug on it, causing the bell to ring at night. Imagine you're a cemetery watchman. You're sitting by the fire and suddenly you hear ding ding. Many times, people would open such coffins and find the person already dead, but with signs of panic inside. The rope was pulled, fingernails were broken, they hadn't been saved in time. Over time, these systems were abandoned. It was believed that medicine had become more accurate, but in reality, practice shows they stopped using them too soon. Sometimes the dead don't ring a bell, but call right from the morgue. A photographer from Mumbai came to the morgue to do a report on the facility's renovation. Everything was going according to plan. Photos of the drawers, the instruments, interviews with the staff. And suddenly, he heard a rustling sound. He thought it was rats. He came closer. One of the plastic body bags moved. He stepped back, frightened, but then called for the orderlies. They opened the bag. The man inside was breathing weakly, but unmistakably. He had been declared dead after a car accident. No instruments were used. Just a visual check. His pulse was weak, his breathing shallow. The doctors were in a hurry. The ICU was overcrowded. He survived and filed a lawsuit, but the case was quickly closed and the morgue staff were simply fired. Officials stated that there was no malicious intent, but after this incident, a wave of fear swept through Mumbai. People began to demand 2 opinions from different doctors before sending bodies to the morgue. And yet, no amount of double-checking will help if they decide to put you to rest before an examination, especially if it happens at a crematorium. It sounds like a nightmare, but one of the creepiest cases happened in China. A man in his 50s was brought to the hospital with a stroke. 6 hours later, the doctors declared him dead. The body was wrapped up and sent to the crematorium. There, a worker was already preparing the furnace when he noticed the corpse twitch. He called a colleague, but the colleague just smirked. "You imagined it," he said. The furnace was heated up. The worker wheeled the car over, and at that moment the man let out a muffled groan. Did they save him? Yes, but it was a miracle. Only because the crematorium was nearly emptied that day, and the worker had the courage to stop the process. The man was taken back to the hospital. A week later, he gave an interview where he said, "I heard the furnace door open, I felt the heat. I was screaming inside, but no one could hear me." In a village near Lagos, Nigeria, a worker named Yusuf was digging a grave. Just another ordinary shift: scorching sun, damp earth, the smell of incense. The neighboring grave had been filled in just an hour ago. Yusuf moved closer to even out the area, and suddenly the ground started to move. He felt faint. He stepped back, then, overcoming his fear, put his ear to the ground. He could barely make out breathing and a faint thumping. He didn't call anyone, he just started digging. After a few minutes, the lid appeared, and then a hand scratching at the board. The man inside was semi-conscious but alive. As it turned out later, the man's name was Amalayo, and he suffered from a rare disease that caused prolonged catalepsy condition in which the body becomes completely motionless, as if dead. His relatives thought he had died. The local paramedic confirmed the diagnosis by sight. After being rescued, Amalayo was unable to speak for a long time. Doctors said that he could have died in another half hour from lack of air and panic. He was saved only because Yusuf was attentive and didn't run away, as many others would have. But more often, such cases end differently. And all because people trust those who are supposed to know more. Doctors, pathologists, but they make mistakes too. And that's when things become truly terrifying. In a small town near Vienna, a man named Thomas woke up on a cold metal table. He couldn't move. His body was paralyzed with fear. The first thing he saw was a white ceiling. The second was a scalpel in the doctor's hand, moving toward his chest. The pathologist was already about to make the first incision. The doctors had diagnosed death from a sedative overdose. Thomas was declared dead and sent for an autopsy. The problem was that he was still alive. His body was simply in a deep drug-induced coma. When he made a hoarse sound, the doctor at first thought it was a post-mortem reflex. Only after a few seconds did he realize the patient was breathing. Shock, panic, the nurse's screams. Thomas survived, but his story essentially had no consequences. The hospital acknowledged it as an accident. However, this incident became the reason for revising autopsy protocols throughout Austria. Everyone makes mistakes, but when the mistake is a scalpel in the chest of a living person, the price becomes far too high. And what's even more frightening is not the mistake itself, but the deliberate concealment of such cases. In one of Russia's major cities, a former funeral home employee anonymously shared how he had more than once encountered people who were not quite dead. According to him, there were times when fingers moved in coffins, eyelids fluttered, and even sounds were made. But no one raised the alarm, because it meant trouble, scandal, money, time, and worst of all legal consequences. We simply pretended not to notice, closed the lid faster, turned away, because it was easier to bury them than to admit that someone was still alive. It sounds like the plot of a horror movie, but according to him, this happened several times a year, most often with elderly people whose signs of life are hard to detect. Sometimes crematorium workers would talk about hearing muffled sounds coming from the furnace or seeing bodies bend inside. Everyone blamed it on muscle spasms, because otherwise it would be a criminal case. And while everyone stays silent, these terrifying incidents keep multiplying. And this happens especially often in places where people aren't used to asking questions, where things have always been this way. Russia is a country of contrasts. But there is one thing in which it consistently leads: the number of mistakes made when diagnosing death. In just the last 20 years, more than 24 cases of people coming back to life at funerals, in morgues, even during autopsies, have been officially recorded. In Siberia, an elderly man regained consciousness right in the morgue. He was already being prepared for embalming when he suddenly groaned. In Krasnodar, a woman started banging on the lid of her coffin a minute before she was to be lowered into the grave. And in Tyumen, an orderly ran out of the morgue in tears after hearing the voice of a corpse asking for water. Many such stories never make it to the media. Relatives don't want any fuss. Hospitals don't want inspections. The system covers up mistakes, and people keep waking up in the most inappropriate places. Only by then, it's already too late. When a person dies, or seems to die, it's important to know how to distinguish death from a condition that only looks like death. No single sign or even two signs are enough for this. True confirmation requires comprehensive procedures. There are conditions that can be mistaken for death: hypothermia, deep coma, catalepsy, drug-induced paralysis. All of these are traps. A person may still be alive, it's just that their body isn't showing any signs. This is especially relevant in places where equipment is outdated or completely absent. The pulse may be too weak, breathing almost imperceptible, and the pupils may not respond. None of this means the person is dead. Only an ECG, an electroencephalogram, and a full examination can provide an accurate answer. That's why everyone should know, if a loved one is dying, you must not rush. You need to insist on a thorough diagnosis, even if the doctors are confident, even if they say everything is already clear. Because as long as it's not too late, it's possible to save them. And perhaps knowing these signs might one day save one of your loved ones or even you.